Have you ever wondered why a woman, once calm and accommodating, suddenly vanishes without rage, without warning, without regret? She doesn't leave in fire, she leaves in silence. And silence, to a man who lives in his mind, is unbearable. Carl Jung did not hate philosophers because they were wrong. He hated them because they were cowards. They dissected truth like a corpse. They spoke of love, pain, and the divine, but only at arm's length, from the safety of books, from the scaffolding of logic, never from the depths of surrender. To Jung, the philosopher was a man in a locked tower, holding the key in his pocket, refusing to descend. Because to descend is to feel. To feel is to risk madness. And madness, especially the kind stirred by the feminine, shatters everything the ego builds to feel safe. You've seen it, haven't you? A man obsessed with ideas, fluent in theory, deaf to emotion. He studies power but has never stood still in the presence of a woman who radiates it. He worships wisdom, but trembles when faced with raw instinct, chaotic truth, unpredictable knowing. And maybe you were her, the woman who tried to meet him on his battlefield of intellect. You thought, if I just explain myself well enough, he'll understand. You spoke with calm precision. You gave him space. You folded yourself into footnotes, disclaimers, and disclaiming your desires. But your soul? It didn't want to be understood. It wanted to be felt. The moment came, quiet, cold, inevitable, when your words no longer mattered. And in that moment, you finally realized you weren't arguing with a man. You were arguing with his fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of surrendering to what could not be mapped. Fear of you. Not the woman who agreed with his ideas, but the woman who exposed his illusions. So you stopped. You stopped trying to translate your truth into language that made him comfortable. And it wasn't hate you felt. It was something colder, indifference. The kind that doesn't scream, it disappears. Carl Jung understood this. He knew the true feminine is not a passive muse or intellectual sparring partner. She is an initiator, a force that demands the masculine descend into his own soul, not just think about it, feel it, bleed for it, break for it, rebirth from it. And most men, especially those trapped in philosophical pride, will never dare, because the descent strips them of superiority. And to a man whose power lives only in his intellect, that feels like death. But to a woman like you, that death is sacred. It's where you meet the self, not the egoic shell, but the shadowed golden truth buried beneath centuries of shoulds, shame, and suppression. That is why you too hate the philosopher, not the man himself, but what he represents, the part of you that once begged to be seen, rather than choosing to be whole. You see it now. The regret was never yours. It was always his. He just didn't know it until your silence echoed louder than all his arguments combined. And by then, you were gone. A philosopher clings to his thoughts the way a drowning man clutches driftwood, but thoughts do not float. They sink. And when a woman, whole and awakened, walks into his life, he does not rise with her. He analyzes her. He dissects her mystery, trying to place her wildness into categories, into logic, into something that doesn't threaten his delicate structure of control. But the feminine is not meant to be understood. She is meant to be met. On the battlefield of soul, where language dissolves and only presence remains. Jung called it the shadow, the disowned truth, the denied impulse, the chaos that logic fears, but he also whispered of her twin, the anima, she who seduces not with skin, but with silence. She who lures the rational mind down into madness, not to destroy it, but to rebirth it. Some women carry this anima in their gaze. They are the ones who do not chase, they mirror, they hold space, not for comfort, but for confrontation. And the philosopher? He calls her dangerous. He blames her for the tremors she awakens in him, unaware that the shaking is not a sign of her cruelty, but of his walls crumbling. He does not realize that the part of him she threatens is not his manhood, but his mask. And if you've ever been that woman, the one who was feared more for your silence than for your screams, you know. You know the moment when his words, once sharp and confident, start to crumble into hesitation. You see the cracks. He begins to ask too many questions, not to understand you, but to defend himself from what you represent. A world where control means nothing, where truth isn't clean and healing isn't linear, where he cannot predict your reactions because they are not pre-written. They rise from intuition, instinct, the deep knowing only women born of shadow work can embody. And when he cannot control you, he tries to outthink you. He uses logic as armor. But logic, when worn too tightly, becomes a cage. Carl Jung saw this with excruciating clarity. He watched men lost in their ideas, terrified of embodiment. He watched women shrink themselves to become palatable, to avoid being called irrational, too much, emotional. But the feminine is supposed to be too much, because she is more than what a limited ego can comprehend. Philosophy, when divorced from the body, becomes sterile. Just like love, when stripped of danger, becomes obligation. Just like femininity, when stripped of darkness, becomes performance. Jung didn't hate thinking. He hated thinking that denied being. And you? You hated it too, not in words, not even consciously, but in the way your body went cold when he tried to explain away your grief, in the way your heart pulled back when he asked for logic instead of vulnerability, in the way your spirit whispered, "He doesn't see me. He only sees what I mean to him." And that was the moment you left. Not physically, not right away, but emotionally, spiritually. You slipped into the shadow, where he could no longer follow. And as he searched for you in the ruins of his mind, trying to reconstruct a formula for your affection, you remembered. You were never his to understand. You were a storm, a mirror, a test. And he failed. Not because he wasn't intelligent, but because he was afraid to feel. The philosopher builds towers. But you became the earthquake. He never truly wanted to touch you, only to grasp you. But the sacred feminine is not something to be grasped. She is not an object of thought. She is a force of nature. To try to define her is to kill her. To dissect her mystery is to bleed her dry. And so, he failed. Not because he didn't know enough, but because he couldn't unknow. He couldn't surrender what Jung called the tyranny of intellect. The compulsion to explain everything in order to feel safe. But some things were never meant to be explained. And that's what terrifies the rational man. That is what Carl Jung saw in philosophers and psychologists who stared at the soul through microscopes, but never dared to dive into its waters. Because in the water, you drown. In the water, you remember? There is no ladder of logic to climb when you're sobbing into your own reflection at midnight, realizing the man you wanted never actually wanted to see you. He only wanted a projection he could control. He wanted the idea of a woman, not her rage, not her depth, not her erotic chaos, not the goddess curled up inside her grief. Jung loathed the kind of mind that used philosophy to bypass pain. He knew that too much thinking was a symptom of repression, that the man who talks endlessly about meaning often has no intimacy with the wildness of his own heart, that he fears women who don't beg to be decoded, who wear silence like red lipstick, who seduce without trying, simply by being real. Do you understand this power? Have you felt it in yourself? That quiet fire when you stop explaining your emotions. That sacred refusal to justify your boundaries. That moment when you realize that your presence alone is more confronting than any argument you could ever win. Some women awaken to this truth slowly, Others are cracked open by betrayal. But all of them, at some point, meet a man who makes them feel like a puzzle. And when they do, something inside them breaks. Not their self-worth, not their softness, but their desire to be understood by someone who has no intention of feeling them. And that break is holy, because it leads to one terrifying but liberating realization. You were never meant to be understood by him. You were meant to outgrow him. You were meant to leave behind the cold intimacy of intellectual men who only loved the sound of their own theories, who feared the messy, non-linear spiral of feminine healing, who praised logic but mocked intuition, who quoted Nietzsche but flinched at tears. Carl Jung hated philosophers not because they were thinkers, but because too many of them forgot to feel, because they denied the shadow and worshipped the persona, because they traded aliveness for certainty. And you? You hated them too. Not for their minds, but for how small they made you feel when your soul asked for touch and they gave you text. For how they made you question your knowing. But now you know. Now you've stepped into the shadow and made a home there. Now you understand why Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Now you watch them try to explain away your magic and you smile. Because, their intellect may be vast, but your depth is untouchable. What if the very thing you thought made you weak, your emotional chaos, your wordless knowing, your spiraling heartbreak, was actually your greatest weapon? What if logic was the veil, but your feelings were the truth? What if silence wasn't absence, but alchemy? This was the knowing Jung respected more than the dry cleverness of philosophers. He saw how women, often dismissed as irrational, were actually closer to the unconscious, closer to the shadow. They weren't distracted by the glitter of perfect language or trapped in sterile arguments that led nowhere. No, when a woman weeps, it isn't for show. It's a descent. And when she rises again, she's changed. Men who feared the transformation cloaked themselves in philosophy. They tried to rationalize the world so they wouldn't have to feel it. They tried to solve the mystery of the feminine instead of bowing to it. But mystery is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a portal to be surrendered to. And you, watching this now, have seen this dynamic play out more than once. You felt the burn of being reduced to a case study, of hearing your pain analyzed instead of held, of being told your standards were unreasonable, of being labeled too much for daring to want more than emotional scraps. And still you stayed, because part of you thought that if you just explained yourself clearly enough, he'd finally understand. But he didn't want understanding. He wanted control. And Jung knew this. The ego, when unexamined, becomes addicted to control. It fears the feminine because she is wildly sovereign. She can't be argued with. She can't be outsmarted. And that terrifies men who worship logic but lack soul. That's why philosophers failed to impress Jung. They studied the heavens but refused to look at their own hells. They spoke of ethics but avoided their shame. They postured as seekers while running from the very thing that would heal them, the unbearable intimacy of being seen. The feminine sees, not just what you present, but what you hide. And that's why she's dangerous. She knows when a man's words are armor. She knows when his smile is hollow. She knows when his confidence is just fear dressed in charisma. And for that knowing, she's been mocked, dismissed, labeled as emotional or dramatic or irrational. But what if irrational was just another word for intuitive? What if dramatic was how the soul expressed its breaking? What if your tears were more honest than any philosopher's thesis? Somewhere in the ashes of your last heartbreak, you realized you were never too much. You were just too awake. And so now, you sit in rooms of quiet men who talk about life as if it were a concept. And you listen, but you no longer shrink, because you have lived through what they only theorize. You've descended into your shadow and come back with your bones rearranged. You've loved in ways that tore you open and made your ego beg for mercy. You've learned the language of grief, the scent of betrayal, the silence of dignity. And when they look at you trying to decode, define, or debate you, you don't answer. You don't need to, because the most dangerous woman is not the one who argues back. It's the one who knows she doesn't have to. You've become that woman. Not because you read it in a book, but because you felt it, lived it, died, and were reborn by it. So let them talk. Let them quote Plato. Let them argue about existence. Let them draw maps of what they'll never dare to walk through. Because you are the storm their philosophy was too afraid to name. When a woman begins to see through the illusion of intellectual superiority, when she stops romanticizing a man's cleverness and starts craving his courage to confront himself, everything shifts. She no longer swoons at eloquence. She watches for silence. The kind of silence that isn't avoidance, but presence. The stillness of a man who doesn't need to explain because he knows. Carl Jung's contempt for philosophers wasn't born of jealousy. It was born of disappointment. Because men with the greatest minds so often had the smallest hearts. They circled around truth, but never let it break them. They spoke of love without ever surrendering to it. They wrote about humanity without touching the raw, bleeding pulse of their own. The ego's regret, the great one, is not that it was wrong. It's that it refused to feel. And how many women have sat across from men like this, hoping they would someday drop the mask and simply feel something real? But no, he'd rather dissect love than live it. He'd rather quote Camus than admit he's lonely. He'd rather call you irrational than confess he's afraid of you, because you are his mirror. And not the soft kind. You are the mirror that reflects back every suppressed longing, every unresolved grief, every feminine wound he's buried beneath his degrees and his debate skills. And that's what makes you dangerous. You're not interested in being admired anymore. You're done performing cool girl understanding just to keep his ego intact. You've realized that shrinking yourself into an intellectual accessory is not a prize. It's a prison. So now you speak less, but when you do, your words cut, because they come from the place philosophers fear most, the body, the aching, pulsing, feeling body, the body that knows trauma and knows when someone is lying, even if the lie is cloaked in impeccable grammar and soft academic tones. You've learned to read the air between words, to hear the cowardice in his cleverness, to feel the hollowness of an argument designed only to win, not to connect. And you're not playing anymore. You don't want a man who can impress you. You want a man who can meet you in grief, in silence, in the dark room where his mother never held him, and he pretends that's fine, in the hollow place where his father told him feeling was weakness. Jung knew that most men live as amputees, cut off from the feminine within. They armor themselves in logic to avoid the terror of vulnerability. But without that descent, they never become whole. They become articulate ghosts. And you? You are tired of falling for ghosts. You want to touch a man's soul, not his theories. You want to be met in your fire, not studied like a strange equation. And so you've stopped apologizing for your intensity. You've stopped twisting yourself into understanding his limitations. You've stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt just because he sounds smart. Because you know what wisdom feels like now. It doesn't talk down to you. It listens. It witnesses. It bows. And if he can't do that, if his pride is louder than his presence, he can go. Because you no longer chase, you invite. And if he cannot descend into his own soul to find you, you'll walk alone. Not out of bitterness, but because solitude in truth is sweeter than company in pretense. You've met yourself. And that is more than most philosophers will ever do. The irony is almost cruel. The very men who spend lifetimes studying what it means to be human often forget how to be human. They analyze death, but are terrified of loss. They write about passion while avoiding the heat in their own chest. They quote the Stoics, but never once weep without shame. Jung didn't hate philosophy. He hated how men used it. Used it to hide. Used it to control. Used it to escape the raw, shattering beauty of emotional truth. He saw how thought could become tyranny. How intellect, unbalanced by soul, turns brilliant men into brittle gods. And women, real women, have always known this. Not from reading books, from surviving them. From listening to a man explain her emotions back to her in terms he could handle. From holding space for him as he dissected her pain instead of feeling his own. From shrinking her intuition into palatable phrases so he wouldn't call her crazy. But no more, because now she sees it clearly. The shadow of the philosopher is the fear of the feminine. It is the fear of surrender, the fear of the irrational, the fear of the embodied chaos that breathes life into dead ideas. But what if, just once, a man dropped his theories and held you instead? What if, instead of challenging your logic, he dared to listen with his heart? Not to win, not to argue, but to witness you, to feel you. What if he fell apart in your arms and finally admitted, "I don't know, but I want to"? That's not weakness, that's transformation. That's the beginning of individuation. When the man returns to the feminine, not to conquer her, but to remember himself. Jung understood that the psyche doesn't heal in philosophy books. It heals in the moment you stop performing. The moment you stop explaining yourself to be acceptable. The moment you let your silence speak louder than any theory. And that is your power now. You do not need to prove anything, not your brilliance, not your worth, not your pain. The feminine that is no longer begging to be understood becomes sovereign. She becomes the mirror that reflects only truth, not the truth he crafted in his head, but the truth of his own disconnection. And so he will either rise or retreat. Either way, you don't bend, you've done the work. You've descended into your own soul. You've faced the shadows philosophers name, but fear to touch. You are not here to debate your existence. You are here to embody it. To move through this world not as an idea, but as a force. Quiet, magnetic, undeniable. And if he cannot meet you there, let him stay in his head. You are not interested in men who merely think. You are drawn to those who feel, who burn, who become. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase. She chooses.